In this module, we will look at common functional groups that are found in biomolecules. All living things are based on organic compounds. When looking at the structures of organic molecules, you'll notice that they are all based on carbon and hydrogen, and they will typically have certain atoms grouped together. These groupings are referred to as functional groups. For example, here we have oleic acid. It's a fatty acid that occurs naturally in various animal and vegetable fats and oils. It's an unsaturated fatty acid due to the carbon-carbon double bond found here. It actually has two common functional groups, one being the carbon-carbon double bond, and the other is a carbon bonded to two oxygens, as shown here. Here we have ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate. It's the main source of energy for many processes in the body. It has three common functional groups, as shown here in the three green circles. In this module, we will have a look at some common functional groups in biological molecules, also known as biomolecules. What are functional groups? Functional groups are specific groupings of atoms within molecules. They have predictable physical properties and will undergo similar chemical reactions regardless of the other atoms present in the molecule. The most common functional groups found in biomolecules, and the ones we will look at, are hydrocarbons, alcohols, thiols, aldehydes and ketones, carboxylic acids, amines, and phosphates. Hydrocarbons are functional groups consisting of only carbon and hydrogen atoms. Because the electronegativity values of the atoms are very similar, hydrocarbon groups are considered nonpolar, and so they wouldn't be attracted to polar substances such as water. There are four main types of hydrocarbons. There are alkanes, which are groups that only have carbon-carbon single bonds. There are alkenes, which are groups that have at least one carbon-carbon double bond. Alkynes are groups that have at least one carbon-carbon triple bond. And lastly, there are groups referred to as aromatics, which are special ring structures. Here are some examples of alkanes, propane being a fuel used for barbecues. Alkenes, notice the carbon-carbon double bonds. Alkynes have the carbon-carbon triple bond. And then we have the aromatic compounds, which have these special ring structures and what appears to look like alternating double bonds and single bonds. Alcohols are characterized by having an OH group, also known as a hydroxyl group, and it is attached to a hydrocarbon represented by the symbol R. Molecules can have a single OH group, like in this case here with ethanol that only has this one hydroxyl group, or it can have multiple hydroxyl groups, as shown here in glucose. Thiols are similar to alcohols, except that the oxygen atom is replaced by a sulfur atom. The most common example of a biological molecule with a thiol group is the amino acid called cysteine. Cysteines play an important role because the sulfurs will form a disulfide bond, which is critical for the 3D shapes of certain proteins. Aldehydes and ketones are both functional groups that contain a carbon-oxygen double bond. It's also referred to as a carbonyl group. So what is the difference between an aldehyde and a ketone? An aldehyde is a carbonyl group that is sandwiched between a hydrogen atom with either another hydrogen atom or an R group. The R group represents a hydrocarbon which may or may not contain other functional groups. For example, here in ribose. So here you have your carbonyl group attached to a hydrogen. This represents the aldehyde, and the carbon is also attached to an R group. So in this case here, this R group is made up of carbons, hydrogens, and hydroxyl groups. Because the hydrogen atom is bonded to the carbonyl group, the aldehyde is always located at a terminal position of a molecule. The simplest aldehyde is formaldehyde. It's a solvent that is actually commonly used in preserving tissues. Ketones are like aldehydes, except that the carbonyl group is sandwiched between two R groups. For example, the simplest ketone is acetone. Here, the carbonyl group is sandwiched between two CH3 groups, so two R groups. It's actually a very common organic solvent that can dissolve many other organic substances. Fructose, which is a sugar, is also another substance that has a ketone. So the carbonyl group here is attached to this R group as well as this larger R group, both of which contain hydroxyl groups. Carboxylic acids is another functional group that includes a carbonyl group, except that it is bonded to a hydroxyl group and an R group. It's described as being an acid because the hydrogen bonded to this oxygen here can dissociate as a hydrogen ion. A couple of examples that contain a carboxylic acid group includes acetic acid, also known as vinegar, and lauric acid, which is a type of lipid. If we compare carboxylic acids to alcohols, you'll notice that they both have hydroxyl groups, here and here. But the hydrogen ion from alcohols is actually very difficult to release. And the reason is due to the stability of the resulting oxygen anion once the dissociation occurs. In the carboxylic acid, once the hydrogen ion dissociates, the double bond to the carbon atom constantly flips back and forth between the two oxygen atoms in a phenomenon called resonance. The result is that the negative charge is shared over two oxygen atoms rather than being stuck on only one. The reasons for this goes beyond the level of this module, but you can envision spreading out the negative charge over a larger surface of the molecule, which creates a more stable anion. This is why we can draw the structure with a dotted line to show the double bond moving back and forth between the two oxygens and the negative charge being spread out over the two oxygens and the carbon atom. Alcohols, on the other hand, do not have an adjacent double bond oxygen. And so if the hydrogen ion is released from the hydroxyl group, the negative charge is stuck only on the one oxygen atom. And so the resonance effect is not possible in alcohols, which is why it's difficult for the hydrogen ion to dissociate. Amines are structures that resemble ammonia, except that one or more of the hydrogen atoms is replaced with a hydrocarbon group. When one hydrogen is replaced with an R group, then the amine is described as being a primary amine. If two of the hydrogens have been replaced with an R group, then the amine is described as being a secondary amine, and if all three hydrogen atoms have been replaced, then it'll be considered a tertiary amine. Amines are important functional groups in amino acids, which are the building blocks found in protein. All amino acids have a primary amine, which is used to form bonds or links to other amino acids. The amino groups can also be involved in hydrogen bonding, since the hydrogen atoms are bonded to the highly electronegative nitrogen atoms. Nitrogen likes to have 3 bonds and 1 lone pair of electrons. But the lone pair of electrons can attract hydrogen ions in solution, and so essentially amines can act as a base to reduce the amount of hydrogen ions in solution. Because the lone pair of electrons were used to form a bond to the hydrogen ion, the nitrogen would then have 4 bonds and no more lone pair of electrons. The result is that the nitrogen would become positively charged, which is why we see the charge here. The last functional group is the phosphate. The structure is very similar to phosphoric acid, where the phosphorus atom in the center is bonded to 4 oxygens, one of them through a double bond, and the others are through single bonds. In a biomolecule, the phosphate group would be attached to the rest of the molecule through one of the oxygens. The other oxygens here can be bonded to R groups as well, or it can be part of a hydroxyl group. Because of the double bond, the hydrogen ions from the hydroxyl groups can dissociate easily. So these here can actually dissociate easily. Like carboxylic acids, once the hydrogen ion is released, the resulting negative charges can be spread out over all of the oxygens, making it stable, and this would be due to the resonance phenomenon. Phosphates are commonly found in adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. It is one of the most important compounds in the biological system because it serves as one of the main energy sources in cells. They are considered high-energy compounds that are critical to power many vital functions in various processes. You may have noticed that the phosphorus atom does not actually obey the octet rule. It can actually have more than 8 electrons around it. Here you can see that the phosphorus atoms have 10 electrons around them. This is often the case for any of the elements that are in row 3 or lower on the periodic table. In summary, functional groups are specific groupings of atoms. They have predictable physical properties and will undergo similar chemical reactions regardless of the other atoms present in the molecule. The most common groups found in biological systems are hydrocarbons, alcohols with the hydroxyl groups, thiols, amines, aldehydes, ketones, carboxylic acids, and phosphates. See if you recognize any of these functional groups whenever you come across a biomolecule.